Is it recording? Yeah, it's recording. All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Noah Blaylock Show. Today, I'm excited to be talking with Alex Newman, and some of the things we're going to be discussing is a list of crimes committed by educators. Some of those things are child abuse through educational malpractice, contribution to minor delinquency through sex education, drug abuse, educational malpractice, destruction of biblical or belief in biblical religion, extortion, treason. We'll be talking a little bit about the history and a little bit more. So let me introduce everyone to Alex Newman. Alex Newman is an award-winning international journalist, educator, author, and consultant who seeks to glorify God in everything he does. Alex co-wrote the book Crimes of the Educators, How Utopians Are Using Government Schools to Destroy America's Children. He is the executive director of Public School Exit, serves as president of the small media and information consulting firm Liberty Sentinel Media, Inc., and writes for diverse publications in the United States and abroad. He's currently serving as a foreign correspondent for the New American Magazine. He's a contributor to the Epic Times, a writer for WND, WorldNet Daily, an education writer for the Freedom Project Media, correspondent for the Law Enforcement Intelligence Brief, and more. His work has been featured at Drudge, Breitbart, Fox News, and many other outlets. Alex has lived in 8 countries: United States, Mexico, Brazil, Switzerland, France, South Africa, Spain, Sweden, and speaks multiple languages fluently and more at varying degrees of proficiency. His work has been cited by governments and major media outlets around the world. Alex is a frequent guest on national and international radio and TV shows. He's also a frequent speaker on TV programs and at conferences, altogether reaching tens of millions of people with the message of faith, family, and freedom. Alex is happily married and has 4 children, along with his family. He currently splits his time between various places, including Europe and the United States. Everything there accurate, Alex?
Yes, sir. Well, now it's 5. The next one technically arrives in January. So he exists. He just hasn't come out into the world yet, but he'll be here soon, God
And
willing.
popped out yet. Awesome. Well, that's good news. All right. So how about we just jump into it, Alex? So this book here, I'll show everybody, Crimes of the Educators. It's a fantastic book. I just finished going through it the second time just to prep for this podcast. So it's called Crimes of the Educators. Alex, is that crimes? Is that hyperbole? Is that exaggeration? Is that really a necessary word to use for our educators?
It is absolutely the appropriate word to use, and we make a distinction. Several lazy journalists have made the error of saying that we're accusing teachers of being criminals. That we're actually one major newspaper in Washington State, the Spokesman Review, on their front page, they said that I had called teachers traitors. And of course, that's not true. If they had bothered to read the book before smearing me about a book that they never read, they would have known that we make a very clear distinction between the teachers, who we say are just as much victims as the students in this case, and the education system, the education establishment that really pulls the strings of the education system. And when we say crimes, that is the exact right word to use. These are criminal offenses that in any other context, you would be absolutely prosecuted. You would be nailed to the wall for these types of things. And in fact, people are prosecuted for these sorts of things every day in America, at the local, at the state, and at the federal level, and for good reason. There's just this kind of blanket wall of immunity that surrounds the education system where they've been able to get away with this. But hopefully, as the American people recognize the crimes that are being committed against our children, against our nation, against our taxpayers, we will start to see some prosecutions, because this is serious stuff. These are crimes that in any other context, people would be horrified by. People would demand justice, and so we need to demand justice here when 75% of our nation's children are being deliberately destroyed.
Awesome. And I'm fully on board with that. Going through, I was kind of aware of some of these things already, but to see the details on these specific things, and these are children who don't have any other recourse. They don't have a voice legally speaking. They can't, take care of themselves. So, I mean, it really is up to adults to take care of this for them. So let's go ahead and jump into the first one. One of your accusations is child abuse through educational malpractice, the whole word method. Let's talk about that.
Yeah, and this is something that handicaps a child for life. That's how serious this crime is. And if you would do this using any other means, using any other institution, people would automatically be horrified. If you were, for example, performing surgery on children and cutting out a piece of their brain that would render them handicapped for the rest of their lives, that would render them illiterate, everybody would recognize that a crime of monstrous proportions was being committed here. And yet, because it happens subtly through the government school system, and there's confusion around this issue because so many of our teachers have been miseducated in government colleges, suddenly it's okay, suddenly we don't pay attention, suddenly nobody gets prosecuted. But so what's happened here is um, back in the 1840s, under the administration of Horace Mann, who was the first ever state secretary of education for any one of our states, he was in Massachusetts, he brought in this experiment into the public schools in Boston. And I'll give a little bit of the background. So the guys who developed this, I need to point out, did it with the best of intentions. They wanted to help deaf children learn how to read. And of course, the traditional way of teaching reading, where you teach a child, each letter and the fact that the letter is a symbol that represents one or more sounds, well, that wouldn't work for a deaf child, because you can't teach a deaf child that a P makes a P sound, right? Because I mean, what does P mean to someone who's deaf? So a couple of reverends, actually one in France and then later one in America, Reverend Golodet, he was running an asylum for what they used to call back then deaf and dumb children, figured out that, hey, maybe we can't teach them the sound of the letters, but we could teach them to memorize whole words. And, a really smart person can memorize a few thousand words. And so we can make at least some of what's on a page accessible to a deaf child. And that was a huge advance in the education of deaf children. So I don't want to impugn the motives of the people who came up with this. They did it with great intentions. They actually did a very good thing, because they made the written word accessible to a whole population of people who could not access it before. Well, Horace Mann tried this in the schools in Boston, and within a couple of years, it was clear that this was an absolute disaster. It wasn't working. I actually have a book behind me. Let me see if I can pull it off the shelf. It's right here. Can you see it? No, not quite. I'll lift my
It's right
camera
at the
up.
top of the frame.
That's right.
Okay.
It's called The New Illiterates, and this was written by Dr. Sam Blumenfeld in 1973. He's the co-author of Crimes of the Educators, and he actually dug into the background and did this research that nobody else had done before. And what he did in the back of the book, he reprinted in the appendix the essay that these Boston schoolmasters had written about this whole word method. It's a very wonderful English and very diplomatically written. They didn't impugn his motives or anything, but they said, look, this method just doesn't work. You just can't teach reading this way. It doesn't work. This is not how children learn how to use reading. This isn't logical, and it doesn't work. So we're not going to use it anymore. And that was the end of that story. Well, about 50 or 60 years later, John Dewey resurrected this methodology. He actually tried it out in an experimental school that he created up in Chicago with Rockefeller money, and cranked out a whole bunch of illiterates who couldn't read properly, including, incidentally, some of the Rockefeller boys. And so he knew. That's why we say this is a crime. If you do something accidentally, if you accidentally run somebody over, if you accidentally punch somebody in the face when you're turning around, it's not a criminal offense. But if you punch them in the face knowing full well what you're doing, that becomes a criminal offense. Then it's assault. And John Dewey understood full well what he was doing with this whole word method. So it wasn't enough.
Horace Mann had the evidence. John Dewey got the evidence again, and later we've seen the evidence produced again and again. I just started reading why Johnny can't read, and so far so good. I'm only a few pages in, but again, the evidence is there and it keeps popping up, and fully aware of the consequences.
That's right. And there's dozens of studies from America's most prestigious universities showing that this is not how children learn how to read. And yet, under the Common Core system, anybody can go to the Common Core website. You can see the kindergarten Common Core standards. They tell you right there that children must learn to memorize high-frequency sight words. And say, oh, well, we throw a little bit of phonics in there. Yeah, sure, after you've messed up the brains and scrambled them with all this sight word nonsense. So we argue that the people who knowingly participated in turning America into a nation of illiterates did so in a criminal manner. And in any other context, again, these people would be prosecuted. If you were deliberately harming children in a way that was going to affect them and harm them for the rest of their lives, you would and you should be prosecuted. And yet when the education establishment does it, oh, well, maybe they did it with good intent. No. There are people who know full well they're turning America's children into illiterates, and that's what they're doing on purpose.
And just so people out there can understand exactly what's happening with the whole word method, if I'm understanding this correctly, correct me if I'm wrong or maybe inaccurate about something. But what's occurring is that instead of learning the basics and forming a solid foundation with phonics, where they're learning our English writing system, is each letter makes a sound or multiple sounds. It's not perfect, but it is a phonic system. Whereas with the whole word method, what's happening is in lieu of that, they're memorizing the entire word, and essentially what's happening is that they're developing a reflex where that is what is placed as their instinct and their go-to, and it's really hard to overcome a habit that you pound into your head 1,000 times a day every day for years.
Precisely. No, that's an excellent explanation. And so, the simplest way to think about it is, you get like a word, right? Say the word deep. Okay. And so instead of recognizing that the D makes a duh sound and two E's together make an E sound and a P makes a puh sound, and then combining those, blending those, and spelling out deep, they're supposed to remember that when they see a series of squiggly lines in that order, that means deep. And you can learn some words that way. The human mind is pretty remarkable. We have an incredible memory system, and you can learn again, really smart people can learn thousands of words that way. But what happens when you come to a word that you haven't memorized? Well, you become handicapped, and that's where they bring in the phonics. So they get your brain developing a reflex, just as you said, so that when you see a word, you approach it as if the word itself were a symbol, like in Chinese, right? The Chinese don't have a phonic system of reading and writing.
Their
They have
characters.
a system where the word itself is actually the symbol. So that's how you would read in Chinese. That is not how you read in English or any of the Latin and Romantic languages, any of the ones that have phonetic writing systems. And so what happens then is the brain gets this reflex pounded into it, and then they start teaching them word attack skills. So what happens when you come to a word that you haven't memorized? And that's when they say, well, now let's use our phonics. Okay, so now we
As a
look at
last
this word.
resort.
Exactly. We look at this word, we don't remember what it is. And so now they call it word attack skills. I mean, it's the most idiotic stuff you can imagine. And so then we start attacking the word. Why would you want to attack a word? Just sound out the dumb word and read it.
Uh-huh.
So this is a crime of epic proportions, Noah.
And it makes sense because when I match that against my past experience, I'm a pretty good reader, I'd like to think. And a lot of times in school or in church, we'd be sitting there reading something, and someone else is reading, and they come across a word, and they stop, and there's this long pause, and I'm like, in my mind, I was thinking, what's taking so long? I mean, I don't want to make it sound like I'm saying you're stupid, but this word, it looks pretty simple. Like you would just sound it out, and you would, even if you had never come across the word before, you would just sound it out and take a best guess at it. And most of the time the results were dismal. I'm like, how is this happening? And now that I've read this, I'm like, oh, that makes perfect sense. Of course, this, because people aren't, for the most part, people aren't just, retarded. People have brains that God endowed them with. And so this makes a perfectly good explanation for how people's intellect has been abused and misused. All right, let's
Yeah.
go ahead and move on to contribution to minor delinquency and the multiple ways that schools contribute to that. I have here the sex education, the drug abuse. Let's see, the whole word method and how the lack of literacy contributes to that, as well as destruction of belief in biblical religion. So go ahead and just dive into that.
Yeah, and actually it flows right from where we are to that. You were talking about how people seem like they might be stupid. And that's one of the things that happens. These children who are otherwise very intelligent, totally normal, they're in first grade, they're in second grade, then they're in third grade, and they're like, well, why can't I read this? I must be some kind of idiot. I don't like school anymore. I don't want to behave anymore. And they act out, and, they don't pay attention, and they throw spitballs, and they give wedges to their friends, and, and so they start misbehaving because they are being led to believe that they're stupid, when in fact the method that they were being used, that they were being taught with, was stupid, not them. And this proceeds right into a whole bunch of other crimes. Contributing to the delinquency of a minor is an actual criminal statute. In almost every state, you can be prosecuted for contributing to the delinquency of a minor. And yet, for some reason, the public schools are immune. And yet they are encouraging children to fornicate, right? Children are not allowed to consent to sexual activity. It's against the law. And yet the public schools are telling them that it's normal and that it's healthy and that they have a right to have sex with whoever they want, whenever they want, right? And then they get STDs, and then they turn to drug use, and then they have abortions, and they murder their babies, right? So the schools are deliberately contributing. The schools are deliberately encouraging children to engage in criminal activity. And there are so many examples of this that it's mind-boggling. And it also proceeds from the underlying worldview that is taught in children in public schools. Now, if you ask the schools what kind of worldview they teach, oh, well, we don't teach worldview.
It's
Of course they do.
neutral.
That's exactly right. That's what they'll tell
Neutral.
you. And yet that is an absolute lie straight from the pit of hell. There are different ways that people look at the world. And there is, of course, the Christian worldview, which is very distinct from the secular, humanistic, Marxist worldview that is taught in the schools today. For example, some very fundamental differences. In the Christian worldview, in the beginning, God created, right? That's pretty fundamental to your worldview. If you believe that in the beginning God created, from that proceed a whole bunch of other things. That means God is the creator of the universe. That means God is the creator of life. That means life has value. That means the same God who created the physical laws gets to create the moral laws. That means there's a moral code that must be obeyed. That means I'm going to be held accountable someday. So all these things proceed logically from that foundational tenet. And that was the dominant worldview in America for a century, even before we were a nation and long into our experience as a nation. Biblical worldview dominated. A Christian worldview was the dominant worldview. But then gradually through the public school system, that worldview has now eroded to the point where people who have a Christian worldview, a biblical worldview, are a very small minority. And this was a deliberate plan by John Dewey. Now, John Dewey, to his credit, was pretty open about his worldview. He was actually one of the co-authors of the Humanist Manifesto, where he outlined his worldview. In fact, he described it as a religious worldview. And I don't understand how somebody could have enough faith to believe this idiocy, but more power to them if they've got crazy amounts of faith like
So
that.
then I want to interject here. Add is you talked about the deliberate adding of this humanist secularist religion, which is appropriate in the context. I want to point out, the phrase deliberate there, because there's a quote here. I found it in one of your articles where, let me just pull it up. All right. So Charles F. Potter, a fellow signer of the Human Manifesto, or Humanist Manifesto, and a Dewey associate, spelled out explicitly what few Americans were willing to see or understand at the time. Education is thus a most powerful ally of humanism, and every public school is a school of humanism, he wrote in his 1930 book, Humanism, A New Religion. And so, open quote, what can theistic Sunday school, meeting for an hour once a week and teaching only a fraction of the children, do to stem the tide of a 5-day program of humanist teachings, close quote. And so again, they were told, people were asking, how's God going to fit into this, government schooling system? And they said, oh, don't worry about it. You got Sunday school. That's what that's for. And then, they turned their backs and like, look at these idiots just taking it. What's 1 hour Sunday school going to do when we have your children 5 days a week for 7 hours a day and even more? So I just wanted to add that deliberate factor in there.
Yeah, thank you, Noah. And there's a lot of humanist commentators who've commented on this. There was one more recently in the Humanist magazine. He bragged that the public school was now the arena of the conflict between what he described as the rotting corpse of Christianity and this new worldview that they are instilling in all of our children. And this actually happened for decades before it became official. Even up into the early 1960s, the children still prayed. They still thanked God. The children were still reading Bible in school. They still, they'd come together for assembly and they'd open up with a reading from the Bible. And this, officially, at least all the way up until the early 1960s, when the Supreme Court intervened and banned prayer and banned Bible in public schools. But decades before that, the humanist worldview had already crept into the point where it was the dominant worldview being taught in the public school system.
And it set the foundation for all this to come about.
Precisely. It really is at the core of almost every subject, right? When they're doing science, they teach from the secular humanist worldview. They teach the children that they evolved from slime that turned into monkeys, that there was billions of years, that there was no God. Sometimes they might not say that explicitly, but it's implied. Mm-hmm. And of course, that is, in my opinion, completely and totally ludicrous. And I say that as a former believer in the evolution cult. I was a, total dyed-in-the-wool evolution believer. I would have drunk the Kool-Aid 1,000 times over until I actually looked at the evidence, because that's what I was taught at school. I was taught that we came from slime that turned into monkeys, and I didn't even hear another perspective. But when I finally looked at the evidence, I realized, wow, I've been deceived on a massive scale. And it bleeds into history as well, right? And it bleeds into English. What kind of texts are they selecting for your reading? What kind of books are
Catcher
you
in the
using to
Rye.
study?
I mean,
Oh,
honestly,
for example.
that was, I mean, a lot of people are going to cite that as great literature. What was the point of that book? Kid runs away, hires a prostitute, doesn't engage in relations, just wants to talk to her, like, and then the book just doesn't really have a conclusion. I'm like, what is this garbage I'm reading? I remember my high school English teacher, one of them, she talks about how she wanted to have us reading Finding Alaska, I think it's titled, and she's like, some parents are object to it. There's like an oral sex scene. It's really awkward, so it's not like really all that bad. And I'm like, you're just sitting here telling children you want them to read a book with an oral sex scene? Like, what is wrong with you?
Yeah.
So just
And
back to
that's
what you're
become the
saying with
norm.
it spreading into everything.
Yeah, and that's the norm today in public schools and in health class, right? No mention at all of God's design for sexual activity, God's design for marriage. Instead, it's all about, hey, go, find as much pleasure as you can. Go have as many sexual partners as you feel like. As long as there's consent, there's no other rules, right? As long as you can get somebody to say that they agree, you can do anything you want. Whereas if they were teaching from a Christian worldview, a biblical worldview, they would say, well, no, God said sex is for this purpose. You should reserve it for marriage. In fact, to do it outside of marriage is an incredibly serious sin. It's called fornication. Not a mention of that in public schools. So this ideology, this worldview, this religion from the pit of hell infects absolutely everything. And when I say ideology and religion from the pit of hell, I really mean that. John Dewey portrayed it as like this kind of atheist, very much like Marx, this atheistic kind of, well, we're just too sophisticated for your God. But really, these are the same lies that have been plaguing humankind straight from the mouth of Satan, going all the way back to the beginning in the garden, right? Genesis 3:5, the serpent says, like, oh, did God really say? He just doesn't want you to be like God, right? And that is the essence of humanism. You are God. You determine what is morally correct and what is not. If you think it's a good idea to have sex with 1,000 people, then hey, what's wrong with that? There's no meaning
There's
to
no
life. There's no
objective
God to hold
reality.
you
There's no
accountable.
objective morality. Everything just whatever
Precisely.
you want. Everything is good. Everything is tolerable. Everything is hunky dory. Everything is awesome. There's nothing bad. Everything until you decide it's bad. Oh, you darn Christians telling my children there's a God. I don't want your religion in my school. Your outdated dogmas.
Yep. And so the humanists were right. The public school became the most effective transmission belt for their evil and dangerous religion, and now we're seeing the fruit of that, right? I mean, America was built on very solid foundations, so it took generations for the poison fruit from this poison tree to start becoming apparent, but we see it all over now. Massive abortions, 50% of marriages ending in divorce, children being raised in single-family homes, drug use exploding. Our civilization is in the process of collapse. We've got ragamuffins out there burning down buildings with people inside because they think Black Lives Matter, so we're going to go burn down a black person's business. I mean, what?
And
And that's what we're seeing.
And just to reach out to some of those who are still skeptical, listening to this later, to tie it back to our original discussion on, schooling and education itself, remember that this is all stemming from correct and incorrect practices of teaching the basics, the foundations reading. I mean, look at a Black Lives Matter or an Antifa crowd versus, like a pro-life rally or a pro-Second Amendment rally. Can you guess which of those crowds is going to be more literate and more educated? Because I think I can take a pretty good guess which one is going to be.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. No, and some of the earliest settlers in America understood this in a way that I think very few Americans do today. In the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1647, this kind of Christian Bible-based society that was developing there, they passed an incredible law, and I talk about this law all the time because it's awesome. It was called the Old Deluder Satan Act. And what they said, there was so much wisdom. They were thinking of it in a different context than is more obvious today. They were coming from Europe, and they were being persecuted for trying to translate the Bible, burned at the stake for trying to preach the gospel and things like that. So they had a different context in mind. But what they said was one of the chief projects of that old deluder Satan is to keep men from knowledge of the scriptures. And so what we need to do here is make sure that everybody can read, so that everybody can read the Bible, so that nobody will be deceived by Satan. And the modern day people turning our children into illiterates, I don't know whether they consciously did or not, but I suspect the enemy was involved, say, hey, if we can turn these kids all into illiterates, they won't be able to read the Bible. And then they will be able to be deceived by that old deluder, Satan. And I think that is
Disconnected from
really at
God.
the core of what's going on here.
I mean, from the beginning, Adam and Eve had to keep some records of some sort for, Moses to later record these things and other prophets to record things. And to those of a lot of my audience will be Latter-day Saints. In the beginning of the Book of Mormon, the first thing that happens is the prophet Lehi and Nephi are commanded to leave Jerusalem, and then eventually they head to the Americas. But as soon as they leave, God says, wait a second, I need you to turn around and go back. You need to get the brass plates from a man named Laban, and on it is the scriptures, recordings of the Old Testament that existed so far. And the first thing he wanted them to do before heading to the New World is to take scriptures with them to remind them of Adam and Eve and the prophets in the history thus far, to connect them to God. And so we've seen that God has implemented reading and writing as a tool of us connecting to him. And when you remove that foundation, well, like you said, we see the fruits, and it's very evident.
Yeah. And, and in addition to not being able to read the Bible when you're illiterate, you also can't educate yourself on anything else. And so this crime of turning children into illiterates is really at the foundation of so many of these other crimes. When you turn children into illiterates, that leaves them incapable of educating themselves on real history, of educating themselves on real science. They have to depend on the television and on, whatever garbage the government decides to pump out. And that is, of course, not a legitimate education. So they're depriving these children, who eventually will become adults, of access to the accumulated wisdom and knowledge of mankind built up over a period of thousands of years. They are cutting us off from our heritage. They are cutting us off from our history. They're cutting us off from our ancestors. And it's a crime that is of such massive proportions that I think the average person struggles to even believe that it's real. And yet the proof is all there.
Yeah, I think it's just on the first page. Yep, right here in the introduction of your book. It is easier to believe a credible lie than an incredible truth, which is exactly, right what you're saying there. Try telling everyone the entire education system has been fabricated to dumb everyone down and to destroy America. That sounds incredible, but it proves true every whit.
Yep.
Let's go ahead and talk about the crimes of extortion and treason.
So, extortion, and I would add into that fraud. You have this public school establishment that is promising us that they are going to educate our children. All we have to do is give them, huge amounts of money every year for them to do that.
Mm-hmm.
Now, think about that in any other context. Okay, any other context. Think of a guy who opens up a burger shop, and he says, "Hey, come to my burger shop, and I'm going to sell you burgers. You just give me money, and I'm going to give you a delicious burger." And you come in and you give him money, and you get a burger, and you take a bite, and it's a big, giant, nasty, rotten, smelly rat in there. Would you say, "Oh man, that sucks. I guess I'll give you more money"? Right? Of course you would, right? You'd take the guy to court. You'd sue him for fraud. You'd contact the local district attorney, and you'd say, "Hey, this guy said he was going to give me a hamburger. Instead, he gave me a giant, smelly, dead, rotten rat." Right? That's exactly what's happening with the public school system. They're saying, "Give us your children, give us a bunch of money, and by the way, if you don't give us your money, we're going to take your house, and if you won't give us your house, we're going to point a gun at you and put you in a cage, and if you won't go into the cage, we will kill you." Okay, that's ultimately what's at the core of the financing of the government school system. And then instead of actually giving us back educated children in exchange for giving them our children and our money, they give us back dumbed down, handicapped, anti-American, anti-family, anti-God little monsters that want to go out and burn down our society and kill old people and take over the government, have a revolution and get rid of all the. I mean, it's absolutely unbelievable. And yet that is what is happening. It should be considered a crime. I would argue that the people who are responsible for this system should be prosecuted. This is fraud.
Absolutely.
This is extra. And the worst part is when people say, "Hey, the kids are getting, or they're all dumb. They're all dumb as a box of rocks. What have you done here?" They say, "Oh, it's just because we need more money. Just give us more money."
It's always more money.
It's always more money.
It's really interesting is that they never say, once we have achieved X amount of financing, then we will produce Y results. It's never a very specific estimation. It's just, oh, more. And then when they get more, it just wasn't enough. And again, on the note of fraud, have you had the opportunity to read blanking on it, The Case Against Education by Brian Kaplan?
I have not, but I've heard of it.
Okay, I got it right here. It's a fantastic book. Actually wrote a study guide to it. You can find it on the linked in the Wikipedia article. But in there, he gives a very solid understanding and picture of how dumbed down people truly are. And if you look at any of the subjects, people know nothing. Foreign languages, if you're fluent in a foreign language, you almost certainly learned it at home, and you almost certainly, absolutely did not learn it in school. People don't know basic science. People don't know, and I can't remember exactly all the numbers, but a lot of people don't know that an electron is smaller than the atom. About only 54% of Americans know that the Earth goes around the sun. So that's absolutely mind-boggling. You look at history. Only 50% of people know the three branches of government, and on and on and on. You look at any of the subjects the school teach, and he makes this point. So if you know half the letters of the alphabet, are you half literate or are you illiterate?
It's a very good point.
You're illiterate, which means if people don't even know half the basic facts of any subject, they don't even understand the foundation of it. That means they're completely and wholly ignorant of the subject in its totality, in its context. Long story short, people don't know history, they don't know science. After they don't know reading. After 13 years, thousands of dollars, and like you said, we got a big dead rat. And another thing that makes me pretty furious is how unaccountable they're held, because they're untouchable. You even look at I'm trying to remember which book I read it in, but even some of the people in the Vietnam War, they were able to sue the manufacturers of Agent Orange. And it was the government that decided to employ that, but they were able to sue the manufacturers in U.S. court and win that legal case. They were able to do that, but you can't. If you get your child out of the school system, they can't read, they don't know anything. You can't sue the school. You can't sue a teacher. You can't sue the school board. You can't sue anybody. They'll just say, "Oh, tough luck, more money."
That's exactly right, and that is the definition of extortion. It's like the mafia, right? Hey, give us $1,000, or we're going to break your knees. And if you do give us $1,000, we'll protect you. It's exactly what the school system is doing. Give us your children. Give us more money. We've got your children. Now give us more money, or we're going to break your children. Okay, now give us more money, or we're going to break your children more. Right? It is absolute extortion. And then treason. Mm-hmm. That's a serious charge. The punishment of treason historically has been death. And we use that word after very careful consideration. And again, the newspaper in Washington that libeled me on the front page, they did end up running a correction after I contacted the editor. They were very embarrassed that they had made such an obvious mistake. I've said over and over and over again, we are not accusing teachers of treason. Teachers have been just as much victimized by this insane system as the poor children. Mm-hmm. But the creators of this system and the operators of this system are very much engaged in treason. Now, John Dewey, to his credit, was pretty honest about what he was doing.
Oh, yeah. Very open.
Yeah, I mean, he was clear. The goal of what he was doing was to fundamentally transform, to quote one of our contemporaries, the United States of America. He wanted to get rid of our constitutional republic and replace it with a Soviet-style system. He actually went to the Soviet Union and wrote this whole series of articles about how wonderful it was and how schools
fantastic,
unbelievable, right? And, to his credit, he didn't probably know yet that millions and millions of people were being slaughtered and all the rest of it. He saw the phony stuff that the Soviets wanted him to see, but that's no excuse, right? Ignorance is not an excuse. And he wanted to overthrow our system of government. He wrote about it very clearly. His model for what America should be was a novel written by Edward Bellamy called Looking Backwards, published in 1888. And it was a fantasy novel about a communist America in the year 2000. He wanted to use the education system to turn America into a communist nation. So instead of using lawful and legal political means, right, if you want to make fundamental changes in the way our government operates, we have an amendment process. You go to the people and you say, hey, guys, I think the government would work better if we had an amendment getting rid of private property, or whatever idiotic idea they want to pass. And then the people could debate it and discuss it. And then our legislatures and our Congress could laugh and say, that's the most idiotic thing I ever heard. And that would be the end of the discussion. What Dewey did was, no, we're not going to go to the people. In fact, he says in the appendix, we republished his essay, The Primary Education Fetish, says change must come gradually. To force it unduly would compromise its final success by favoring a violent reaction. So he knew if he came and honestly said to the American people, hey guys, we want to transform your whole country by brainwashing your children, they would have tarred and feathered him. So instead, he did it quietly, he did it gradually, with the ultimate objective of overthrowing our system of government and making us serfs, essentially, in a giant slave state. And many of the people who are behind the educational system today are very much involved in this same process. I think of people like Bill Gates, who signed an agreement with UNESCO in 2004 to globalize the education system. When you're talking about brainwashing children to overthrow the very foundations, the very system of government of a nation, you might as well come in with an invading army. It's the same thing, only maybe more insidious, because at least the invading army is being honest and they're coming over the border wearing uniforms. These people are doing it quietly and subversively, but the end result is just as evil, and I think the punishment needs to be similar.
Um, you talked about coming in with the army there. I'm trying to remember off the top of my head. I think it was the 1983, 1984 Commission on Educational Excellence. I think
Oh, the
commissioned by
National Commission on Excellence in Education
by
under Ronald
commissioned by
Reagan.
Ronald Reagan. Yeah, I believe he said they in the report it says if a foreign nation or country had attempted to impose this mediocre educational system, and again, this is paraphrasing, so I'm probably butchering it, that we might as well have viewed it as an act of war, and that calls right back to what John Dewey said. It has to come gradual, and because if parents know, if the nation knows straight up like what's up, what's happening, that we just very openly said, yes, we're here to brainwash your children and dumb them down because that will be conducive to the society we want to build, a violent reaction would have happened and would have been more than understandable. And then here we are, lo and behold, years later, someone commission from the government notices and says, hey, this could have been considered an act of war.
Yep. And I think it should be viewed as an act of war. It was an act of war. It just wasn't a war using conventional means. But for example, the communist Chinese, they have what they call a people's war, which they've actually declared on us. And a people's war is a war with everything short of actually shooting and launching missiles. But it can include propaganda, it can include disinformation, and the purpose is to destroy your enemy. Well, these totalitarians running our educational system have declared a people's war on the United States of America, on our system of government, on our basic foundational documents, our Constitution, our Declaration of Independence, and their end goal is to reduce us to absolute slavery. Now, certainly some of the people working within the system don't see it that way. They think that, they're ushering in this wonderful, brave new world. Some of them are literally communicating with demons, and they're pretty open about it. Shirley McCoon, who wrote the national standards under George H.W. Bush and then later Clinton, she was communicating openly with these ascended masters. She wrote a book about it, right? The light shall set you free. These people are absolutely determined to destroy the United States of America as we have known it, but they're not doing it using normal political means. They're not coming to the American people and saying, hey guys, this is why getting rid of our freedom would be a good idea. They're doing it subversively. They're doing it just like you would expect a hostile foreign enemy to do it. And it's incredibly serious. We must take this serious, or we are going to lose our freedom just as surely as if an enemy army marched in and occupied our country.
Mm-hmm. And that's another point I want to touch up on is, we have all these, the conservative movement looks around and says, what's happening? We have all these people clamoring for socialism, wanting to overturn very conservative policies, wanting to make abortion available on demand, no restrictions, wanting increased minimum wage, wanting higher taxes on the rich. And they look around, they say, what's happening? Why is all this happening? I'm like, well, you send your children to a government indoctrination center for 13 years. 13 years. What else do you do for 13 years? That's insane. And we say, what happened? What do you mean what happened? It's very clear and obvious what happened. And so I'm honestly of the opinion that unless government education is overturned and abolished, that any conservative victories that we see will be hollow and temporary. And, give it 20 years, the upper 20 years of people living, once they're dead, and the next 20 years of people come through the system, we'll see an increase in the socialist demographic and a decrease in the conservative constitutionalist one.
Yeah, and that's what we're seeing now. No, it may already be too late. I don't know, absent divine intervention. But you look at my generation, it's so embarrassing to admit that I'm a millennial because everybody automatically and quite properly assumes you're an idiot. And yeah, I don't hold you responsible for holding that view. Trust me. But the data is just absolutely appalling. More than 70% of millennials will vote for socialists in the future, according to scientific polls, right? There was one commissioned by the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. 70% of millennials say they're going to vote for socialists. We've got the religious data. A majority of my generation, now millennials, describes themselves as non-Christian, the first generation in all American history. we're not going to survive as a free Christian nation if this continues. And I think Donald Trump is really was one of the pioneers in exposing this to the nation. He said during his 4th of July speech, the reason for the mayhem in our streets is that our children are being indoctrinated in public schools. He's absolutely right. Now, this is becoming more mainstream. You've had Rush Limbaugh now talking just this year, talking about you got to pull your kids out of government schools. You had Franklin Graham going on Fox News and telling parents in New Jersey, you got to pull your kids out of government schools. So this went from being kind of a fringe movement to being very mainstream. But I agree with you, Noah. If we don't get the children out of the government schools, it's just a matter of time, unless God decides to intervene, and he might, but it's just a matter of time before the foundations of America will be completely overthrown.
Mm-hmm.
And so we actually started a ministry for that purpose. It's called a Public School Exit. I think you mentioned it in the beginning. I am the executive director there, and our entire purpose is to liberate as many children as possible from the horrors of government schools. So we're doing everything we can. We're working with churches. We're trying to get churches to set up their own private schools or set up a homeschool fund. And a lot of progress is being made, for all the horrors that came through the COVID pandemic or scamdemic, whatever you want to call it, the bioweapon attack on the United States. One of the great things is that the homeschool population of the United States has doubled in 6 months. We went from 5% of families with school-aged children homeschooling to 10% of families with school-aged children homeschooling. And we know homeschool families are usually significantly larger than your average family. So more than 10% of American children today are being homeschooled. Less than 3/4 of American children today are in regular government brainwash camps. But we're going to have to do a whole lot better than that. And, I say homeschoolers are so much smarter and so much more knowledgeable, intelligent, logical, reasonable that, they could probably take on 10 victims of government school with half their brain tied behind their back. But still, the numbers don't look good. We have got to get more children out. And I hope that'll be the takeaway for people watching this. If you have children in government school, get them out right
Get
now.
them out.
If you have grandchildren, get them out right now. Whatever it takes. I mean, I tell people I'd live in a cardboard box before I would send my children to be brainwashed and terrorized and indoctrinated by this insane criminal government school system.
Mm-hmm. There are some quotes here I want to read. If I recall correctly, you're a Ezra Taft Benson fan, aren't you?
Yes, absolutely.
Awesome. So here are a couple of quotes from him. And for those who don't know, Ezra Taft Benson was the Secretary of Agriculture under President Eisenhower, and also later on became the 13th president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And here's what he had to say about the government school systems. Sorry, hold on. Here we go. So one quote, and I think these were both from the same address. So as a watchman on the tower, I feel to warn you that one of the chief means of misleading our youth and destroying the family unit is our educational institutions. And then also, the United States system of national popular education will be the most efficient and widespread instrument for the propagation of atheism which the world has ever seen. And that's an astounding claim. You look through the entire history of the world, all the governments, you look at all that, and the largest, most efficient propagation of atheism the world has ever seen. That's a pretty incredible claim.
It is, but it's absolutely correct. That was actually the purpose of the government school system to begin with. If you even go all the way back to the original guys that were pushing this idea, people like Robert Owen, their goal was to destroy Christianity. In fact, he set up a secret society, Robert Owen did, after the failure of his ridiculous communist commune, and a whistleblower came out of this secret society, the name of Orestes Brownson. And what he explained was that Robert Owen had set up a secret society. The goal of the secret society was to get men elected to the legislatures who would support government takeover of education and to shift public opinion in favor of government education. And he said in there, in this book that he wrote exposing this whole secret society, this whole plan, he said it was modeled on the Carbonari. He said the ultimate objective was to eliminate Christianity. That's the main reason that they set this up, guys. When you look at communism, when you look at totalitarianism, you need to understand Christianity is the primary barrier to all of these satanic, these diabolical ideologies. And so that is why the mission has always been to undermine Christianity, to destroy the church, to destroy people's faith in God, because that is the ultimate and the most significant barrier to the expansion of totalitarianism and collectivism in the world.
And that's what I want people to understand, because a lot of times, and I have this conversation a lot of times I hear people say, oh, you can't really blame insert the schools or the teachers, etc. Because a lot of times the family situation at home isn't that great, and family home life is one of the greatest indicators of academic success, which is true. The problem with that claim, though, is you're looking past the fact that our current state on the family institution as the foundation for society has been corrupted largely in part because of our educational system. So to say that it's not the school's fault because the family isn't perfect, well, whose fault is that? Who's been teaching children, go out, have sex, have these broken homes, have fatherless homes, sometimes motherless homes, have children from multiple marriages, there's discord, and that's all the more likely to, destroy family units and the next generation because they don't have a great example from their home life of what to try to establish, and then they're all the more lost, and then all the more influenced by their peers and from their schools who propagate the same system that destroyed them, and they're going to continue propagating that on to the next generation. And so when people tell me you can't blame the schools for X, Y, and Z, I say you absolutely can, and you absolutely must blame the schools. You can't sit there and have your child delivered back to you and just say, oh, well, I can't exactly blame anyone. Well, at that point, you're additionally part to blame if you knowingly leave your child in the system and they come out and you say, oh, there's nothing I could have done. There's plenty you can do. And like you were talking about, there's plenty of options and alternatives to government indoctrination or public schools.
Exactly. And I do hold the parents partially responsible. Ignorance is not an excuse. You have an incredibly important responsibility handed to you by God to raise those children up. If you read your Bible in Deuteronomy, you're supposed to be teaching your children when they wake up, when they walk by the way, when they're eating, when they're going to sleep, not whenever Caesar doesn't have his hands on them. You can read the Bible all day, every which way. You will never see any delegation of authority over education or the raising of children to government or to Caesar. And so parents, I think, have a huge responsibility. Yeah, the government schools are the ones doing the crime, but parents, you're the ones allowing it. There's no law that says you have to hand over your children to be brainwashed. In fact, there are laws specifically protecting your right not to hand over your children to be brainwashed. You have absolutely no excuse for putting your children through that. And I don't mean to sound harsh and I don't mean to sound judgmental, but hey, guys, if the school building is on fire, you as a parent, you don't start a committee, you don't sign a petition, you don't go have a protest, you don't run for school board. You run in there and you grab your child and you run out the door as quickly as you can, and then you sound the alarm so everybody else knows.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, you can't say, oh well, I did my best. I went to go talk to my school board member. No, that's not going to cut it. The building's on fire. Your child is being destroyed. Get them out now.
Mm-hmm. And I want to add to that. There's a document called the Family Proclamation to the World, which was issued by President Gordon B. Hinckley of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And it's echoing, a lot of what it says in the Bible here. It goes right along the lines here. I want to read a short excerpt here. Husband and wife have a solemn responsibility to love and care for each other and for their children. Children are an heritage of the Lord, Psalm 127:3. Parents have a sacred duty to rear their children in love and righteousness, to provide for their physical and spiritual needs, and to teach them to love and serve one another, observe the commandments of God, and be law-abiding citizens wherever they live. Husbands and wives, mothers and fathers will be held accountable before God for the discharge of these obligations. And so that's just a fantastic clip because, again, God gave children to parents. He didn't say, here, community, have a child from this pod. He didn't give them to the government. He didn't say, government, this is your job to rear the children. He said, no, moms and fathers, this is a sacred institution. This is your responsibility and obligation. Of course, nobody's going to be perfect. Everyone's going to, falter. Everyone's going to have their flaws. But, that's not an excuse to not wake up and not be trying to do your best to give everything that you can for your children.
Amen. Yeah, it's absolutely essential. Parents must take charge and they must deal seriously with their responsibilities. Your children are your responsibility. And if you hand them over to Caesar, you should expect exactly what Caesar has promised. And that is that your children will end up ridiculous and brainwashed and dumbed down and believing in all these lies and heresies. So.
Mm-hmm. And so I kind of wrote up a list of, effects that comes from all this. I want to, just do a little quick summary as we're, getting to the end of this interview. Learning disabilities, dyslexia, pornography, premarital sex, disease, depression, emotional crisis, unwanted pregnancy, broken homes, baby killing, fatherlessness, motherlessness, atheism, nihilism, secularism, Satanism, humanism, self-destructive behavior, murder, school shootings, massacres, arson, riots, teen suicide, addiction, death, reduced economic status, ignorance and manipulability, and on and on and on. And what was it Jesus Christ said? By their fruits you shall know them. Well, that's a pretty big list of fruits. And I don't know about you, but I can tell whose fruits these are and whose fruits they are not.
Amen.
A bitter fountain cannot bring forth good water, and a good fountain cannot bring forth bitter water. And so I think it should be pretty evident, you know, to Christians everywhere, and even to those who, aren't of any particular faith, maybe non-denominational or maybe agnostic. Even then, it should still be pretty clear that the school system is a raw deal for everyone, and it's coming at your expense and at the expense of everyone.
Yeah, amen. I couldn't agree with you more. And I say this is not even a partisan issue. You don't have to be a Christian to want your children to learn how to read and to not want your children doing drugs and killing their babies and all the rest of it, joining gangs. And it's this should be an issue that concerns absolutely everybody, but especially Christians, especially people who trust that the Bible is the word of God. The facts should jump out. I mean, if it was a snake, it would have bit you, for crying out loud. So pay attention, folks. There's almost nothing more important than your children. And I hope parents and grandparents will really think about this, pray about it. You have a big responsibility here, and nobody's going to protect your children if you won't do it.
Mm-hmm. And before we close up, just a few logistics on homeschooling. Um, if people have some questions, how old can my child start learning to read, how to switch over, resources, cost, just to speak to them, helping them out. Because if someone's listening to this and they say, okay, maybe that's an option I want to go, what's your advice for them in logistical terms of where can they get started?
Yeah, actually, we have a lot of documents and information up on our website, publicschoolexit.com. We've got, steps to getting out of the public school system, why you need to get out of the public school system. The laws in every state are going to be a little bit different, so you want to go check out the laws. We've got links to the laws of all the different states as well. So if you're in Utah, if you're in Idaho, wherever you are, you can go right from our website. You can find out what the requirements are. Some states, it's nothing. You just don't send your child to a brainwash camp. Other states, you got to, if you're in Massachusetts, you're going to have to jump through a bunch of hoops like a trained poodle. So, depending on where you are, you're going to want to keep that in mind. As for how you do it, there's as many different ways of doing homeschooling as there are homeschool families. No two families do the homeschooling the same way, and that's one of the amazing things about homeschooling. But if you're looking for resources, Freedom Project Academy, I teach there, makes all its book lists available, so you can see what other high-quality educational institutions are using. If anybody has any questions, you can get in touch with us through Public School Exit, or you can get in touch with me. I'll be happy to help. We do hope that many people will consider homeschooling. And for those who can't, for whatever reason, I know there are some, make sure you find a good private school, a Christian school, where your children will learn truth, where your children will learn how to think, where your children will have access to learning how to read properly, and all these other very, very important things.
Mm-hmm. I believe it was President John Taylor, third president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. There's a quote from him, and again, I'm paraphrasing, so I'll probably butcher it, won't do it justice, but he says, there's plenty of you parents out there who say we can't afford to get a good teacher for our child. And he says, you cannot afford not to have a good teacher for your child. I would rather have my child taught by the simple rudiments of a man of God rather than by the most, sophisticated, educated, worldly man who has not the fear of God in his heart. And so I think the last thing that I'd like to leave is, call to action, parents, again, homeschool your children, get them out of the school system, as well as pray. Maybe you don't have, speaking to the audience here, maybe you don't have children. Maybe you're going to have children someday. Maybe you have the children there in school already, or maybe you're already homeschooling your children, but pray, get on your knees, ask Heavenly Father, pray, and, say, help us help our children, say it in your individual prayers. If you, say family prayers, which I would encourage everyone to do, ask him in your family prayers, help this nation, help the children here, help us to turn to you. And so that would be the last thing I would leave off, is that call to action. Anything else, or do you feel like we covered it pretty good? Any last notes or anything?
Yeah, well, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to be with you. I'm not LDS, but it sounds like the leaders of the LDS Church over the years have had a lot of very smart things to say about these issues. There have been some Catholic leaders and some evangelical leaders who've been saying these things as well. And I think now is the time for people of faith everywhere, and even people of faiths other than the ones that we think of. Like, I mean, even if you're a humanist, even if you have faith in nothing, okay, which I think is, a little bit silly, but even if that's you, now is a really important time to pay attention to what's happening in the education system. I agree with you. People need to be praying. Ask God for wisdom. Just open up His Word, open up the Bible, and you will see over and over and over again. It just jumps out at you. God gave your children to you. He didn't give them to your governor or your school board or the Supreme Court. He gave them to you. And He did that deliberately and specifically. Don't fail in one of your most important jobs in this life.
Mm-hmm. And once we've prayed and sought for that wisdom and feel like we have direction, we need to take action. Faith without works is dead. We need to go out there and, put our shoulder to the wheel. We need to not just ask that God, move our cart for us, but after we pray, get out and start pushing and see what He needs us to do.
Amen. Yeah. Thank you so much for having me, Noah. It's been a pleasure.
All right. It's been fantastic having you on here. I'm glad that we got to have you on here. Maybe at some future date, we'll have you on for maybe a part 2. I don't know. We'll see.
Sounds good. Thanks so much,
All right.
Noah. Take care.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
Alex. You too.